Alright y'all, welcome back to the channel and to some more buckshot testing, and today we've got another new load combination that we haven't tried yet, so I'm definitely excited to see what it's able to give us. So for the shell I've brought out here today, I got out some of the Federal copper plated buckshot loads, but these ones are their 20 gauge versions. They are a 2 3/4 inch 20 pellet load of 3 buck moving about 1175 feet per second. Now we've tested some of the Federal Power Shock and I believe some of the Winchester Super X 20 gauge buckshot shells as well, with some pretty terrible performance across the board, really. So can the copper plateds here actually do anything decent for us at all? Generally speaking, the Federal copper plated stuff is a pretty safe bet at getting a decent pattern based on all the 12 gauge testing we've done with it. So I'm hoping that these will be a little bit better in 20 gauge as well than what we have been seeing. So I guess we're just going to have to try it and see if there's any real difference here or not. And as for the setup I've got to run them through today, I brought out the Stevens 301 20 gauge with a flush full choke in here, which is typically what these really like in 12 gauge. So I figured we'll at least start with a full choke in 20 gauge as well and see where we're at, and we can move up or down from there based on what kind of results we see. So definitely a pretty good setup, and yes, we do have a scope on top of here, but it's because we were doing some slug testing recently, but it will not affect us at all for today's test, even though it is buckshot. But we know we should have a pretty decent patterning setup. I think it's just going to come down to what the shells can actually do. So as for today's test, everything is set up the same as we usually do it for a buckshot test. I've got the big sheet of paper at 40 yards. I've got the chronograph so we can get our velocity, and I've got the templates that we can lay up over our target when we go down and look at our results as well. So let's head over here and take our shot with these Federal copper plated 20 gauge 3 buck shells and see if they give us anything decent or usable at all. So far, 20 gauge buckshot hasn't been great, but let's try these out and see if we get any kind of better performance out of them or not. Alright, so that shell gave us 1165 through the chrono. The boss claim is 1175, so 10 feet per second under that boss claim. I would say we're seeing pretty well right exactly what we're supposed to see, especially considering that 301 has a 26-inch barrel. So we're looking just fine for velocity up here, but what kind of a pattern did they give us down at 40 yards? Let's go check it out and see what we got. Alright, so now we're down here at our 40-yard paper, and this is what we got. And immediately, it is the same old, just absolutely nothing short of a disappointment. Now, for reference, the white dot was my point of aim. The paper is 36 inches wide by probably about 42 to 44 inches tall, and we pretty well covered the entire paper with shot. And we had a total of 18 out of the 24 pellets actually hit the paper, and the other 2 are nowhere to be seen. So yeah, that is a pretty terrible performance for a buckshot load. I mean, we've even had the cheapest of the cheap import 12 gauge buckshot shells perform way better than these 20 gauge shells have, regardless of the shot size. So is it just 20 gauge buckshot is pretty terrible across the board? Is it the fact that my 301 doesn't like buckshot, even though it performs great with pretty much anything else I've ever ran through it besides buckshot? Or what? I really don't know on this one. I mean, if this pattern has anything going for it, I would say that it's a pretty even spread of pellets, although it is a giant spread of them. Obviously we have voids in here, but all the voids are pretty much even, so it is a pretty uniform spread. But still, when you're looking at least a 36 by 36 inch pattern at 40 yards, it's really not usable for the vast majority of situations. You might be able to get a coyote or something with that out to 40 yards. Past there, best of luck to you. And to be honest with you, I don't even know that I'd really want to use that for anything at 30 yards either, just judging by how that pattern looks at 40. So once again, I think it kind of speaks for itself. Just a pretty terrible performance. I was really hoping for better out of those copper plated shells, but I guess that's not really the case, at least not yet with a full choke. So now I think the pattern kind of speaks for itself, but I guess we should throw up a couple templates real quick just to look and see how it would look if you would have taken this shell out into the field on a hunt and never tested it through your setup. So let's throw a couple templates up and see what it looks like. Alright, so here's our 10-inch circle, and I think our pattern was just a touch off to the right, so I moved it a touch right to where our core should have been, and we have 1 out of the 20 pellets that are in this shell in a 10-inch circle at 40 yards. That is just absolutely terrible, and unfortunately, I don't think it would really matter where we put this. You would probably never have more than 2 pellets in it, regardless of where you put it on the pattern. So yeah, definitely no core to speak of here. So next up here is the deer template, and if we were to line it up with where our point of aim is, you would have had somewhere in the ballpark of 7 pellets actually hit the deer. Now, would that have technically been enough to get this deer on the ground for you? Most likely so. I mean, you did have a couple of them right through the lungs area there and a little bit farther back, so I do think you would have gotten that deer, but it's definitely not a pattern that I would want to deer hunt with. I mean, you can see even around the edges of the template, we have stuff scattered just all over the place. So definitely not ideal, that's for sure. So technically good enough, yeah, I guess, but not at all what I'm looking to use on a deer hunt. And here is our hog template, and it's pretty much the same story. Technically, would it probably have been good enough? Yes, but it is not a pattern that I would ever use on a hog hunt. And even if you were to coyote hunt or something with this, a coyote would be just a touch smaller than this hog template, and it's pretty much the same story for them. You might have a couple pellets through there, and it might have gotten the job done, but definitely not the performance that I was hoping to see out of these. I would have expected a lot better, especially out of a federal copper plated shell. Typically, they're a very reliable shell, at least from what we've seen in 12 gauge, and they're going to give you some kind of a decent performance through the vast majority of your choke combinations that you would try. But in 20 gauge, I guess that's just not the case. I mean, these are a copper plated shell, obviously, and they are a buffered load, which does help, but the 20 gauge shells do not have the little wad like the 12 gauge shells do. So could that actually be what makes the difference here? Maybe, but even still, a plated and buffered load of buckshot, I would think would do better than that, but that's just not the case with any of this 20 gauge buckshot that we've tried. All right, y'all. Well, what did you think about that performance right there? I was definitely hoping for a lot better out of a federal copper plated shell, without a doubt. But these 20 gauge buckshot shells across the board have done really nothing as far as performance goes for me. Now, it's pretty funny because 20 gauge buckshot seems to bring people out of the woodworks that don't like the way I test things or whatever the case might be, and say that there's only one specific choke that's going to work and it's going to work every time, and that's just not the case. I mean, we can try these through more open chokes, but I can tell you just from experience, that's not going to work with these. If we have any hope of getting them to work, it's going to be with like an extra full, or who knows, maybe even something like a 575 or 585 turkey choke. I really don't know. So I guess leave all your thoughts in the comments. Is that about what you expected to see? Were you a little surprised one way or the other? Have you tested any of Federal's copper plated 20 gauge shells? And if so, what kind of results have you seen out of them? And where do you think we should go from here? Is there a different choke we should try? I can tell you right now that going with less constriction is most likely not going to help these shells out any. So what chokes might you want to see, or might you suggest that we try out next? And if you have seen good performance out of a 20 gauge buckshot shell in general, regardless of if it's a copper plated or not, what setup, what choke combo, and everything else were you using to get that? Because clearly either 20 gauge buckshot is pretty terrible across the board, or my 301 with pretty much any choke I've ever ran through it absolutely hates buckshot. I don't know. Leave all your thoughts down below. At the end of the day here, that is not a pattern that I'm looking for. So definitely a big disappointment for today's results. I would have hoped to see a lot better. But that's why you test things, because you never know what's going to perform and what's really not until you try it. So with that being said, I've got some more testing to get done for you guys, so I'm going to get back to it. As always, we have the channel Instagram as well as the mailbox where you can send stuff if you'd like. All the information will be in the description if you're interested in it, but I'm going to get back to it, so I'll see y'all in the next one.